Hello and welcome here to our blog. I'm not sure that I like this position. Let's go back to the traditional one. I've been thinking a lot about strategy and the paradoxes of the DSA's position, and I've also been looking at the historical strategic alignments of socialists abroad, from the United Front implied in the SPD to the explicit United Front of the Comintern in the 1920s to the Popular Front, the dirty and clean break strategies in America, the ballot line, which I haven't talked a lot about, but it gets a lot of lip service in DSA circles. And I wanted to take two things that I've been reading and that came out in the last couple months, and I'll of course link them in the show notes and everything. And talk about the paradoxes of the strategic implications of the U.S. because it's a lot harder to deal with than a lot of people think. And I am beginning to write a long commentary that's actually so far taking me forever to even get to the commentary on the DSA's current program. And I say program, parts of it read like a platform, and I don't even think that a lot of people understand the difference. And I hear people referring to the current program as a platform all the fucking time. But also, I don't think the platform is going to be something you can hold candidates to, even when deciding about endorsements, which means it doesn't really meet one of my criterions, which is how would you get beyond vibes for figuring out what candidates should be endorsed by the DSA. The DSA's had a lot of victories. It's had more defeats than people are admitting to, but it's had a lot of victories in the last year. Partly, I think, because the DNC's gerontocratic infrastructure is cracking. Its donor base is left. Its traditional alliance with the tech sector, the West Coast tech sector, has broken down, and that's an alliance that goes back not to the Obama administration. It goes all the way back to Gary Hart in the 1980s and the Atari Democrats. So, and the DSA is popular amongst younger people, but it still has the problem that Benjamin Studebaker pointed out 3 years ago, that it is more popular in areas that are already super progressive. And if you look at like the El Said win, which is relatively recent to this, and the Democratic primaries, actually the polls were wrong, not in El Said's favor. By that I mean they overestimated his win. He still won, but not quite as much as a lot of the polls put him at. And the polls on the Republican side were wildly off. And it also looks like MAGA is in more disarray than it initially appears. Now, those are all immediate problems. Those are really tactical problems, right? And I've talked about the 5 layers of strategy for a lot in these last few weeks of videos. I'm not going to talk about that so much today. But there's a paradox here. The DSA right, and I put that in quotation marks because I don't entirely think it's clean what the DSA right and DSA left are on a right and left spectrum. One, both of these kind of views of DSA right and DSA left are represented by the caucuses, and the caucuses are a small part of the DSA life. I have a chapter that that I'm in, that I sporadically go to meetings to and participate in votes on, and occasionally work with the Educational Development Committee, but I've been too busy touring for my book to be as involved this summer as I would have liked. But I've also gotten a lot more of a sense of the structures of the DSA and the problem. A lot of chapters have probably a 1 in 6 to 1 in 10 active membership, meaning that, like in my thing, for example, we usually have meetings of 50 to 80 people. We have a chapter that on paper has 700 members, but on any given vote, including not votes that require you to show up in person and do the formal Robert's Rule of Order debates and the meetings, you usually don't get more than about 100 people participating. So it's like a 1 in 7 active participation rate. It's actually quite low. Then you add to that the amount of press, media apparatuses that are all tied up into the caucuses because of the structure of the DSA, both its structure as a NGO, which I also am one of the few people who talk a lot about, but also its lack of regional infrastructure, which, you know, when I mentioned this to the caucuses and certain chapters, particularly about the New York chapter, there's a lot of pushback. They don't like it. But part of the reason why they don't like it is it would weaken certain groups' hold because of that lack of infrastructure and structure within the DSA itself. Like, there's no regional infrastructure that's significant, that's universal across the country. That what makes up for that are these caucuses, which are tendencies which are allowed in the DSA, and the caucuses are definitely allowed in the DSA, but they're not actually formally part of it exactly. And they actually set the tone for the DSA right and the DSA left, but like most DSA members are not in them. And that's an interesting debate when we talk about some of these DSA right and DSA left things. Now, I've been rambling about the criterion here, but it's actually important before I get into these essays and go into the more, frankly, I've been scripting, as you might notice. I'm a little bit less obviously winging it these days. I've been scripting a lot of this out, and I've been thinking a lot about this strategy issue because it really is a bind. I pointed out that, yes, we can't hold electeds accountable, and I don't think this new program is going to do that. And I think there's problems with the program, but I think, you know, each of the major program parts I actually can interpret in a way that I would support. I can also interpret it in a way that I wouldn't. I think that's kind of the point. That in and of itself is not bad. The problem is it's also not scoped. So like maximalist and minimalist demands are often like ran together, and there's other things that like just assume people know what you mean by the Green New Deal or whatever and how they're tying everything into it. There's also the fact that, like, yes, it mentions, I've said, you know, in a few places that like there is no education policy in here other than we need universal higher education access, which I'm like, I'm not against it, but it's not as progressive as it sounds like. And then people will point out, oh, well, there's universal pre-K in there. And I'm like, well, universal pre-K access, while voluntary, is pretty much around in about over half states. So that's still like your program is something that most of the United States already has. I guess you're just going to universalize that. That's cool, but that's not really an educational program. And there's no other guidance or our demands or even vision maximalist or vision orientation statements about it. But beyond all that, there's a fundamental issue about the way political parties work in the US that I think these two articles that I want to talk about and compare and contrast and pull the problems with really get us into. And one is, not only is a ballot line technically in the US in almost all states illegal to hold candidates to, and I'll talk about what that means. And this was a change that really emerged in the pro-democracy movement in response to the 1968 Democratic Party convention. But the other thing is, you are in a bind for third parties because of other state laws, like particularly after the Ross Perot push in 1992 and again in 96, and when Nader really was a real threat. But also going back historically to like 1918, where you had both the Bull Moose Party and the Socialist Party taking major portions of the vote away from the two major parties. There has been a 100-year tradition of limiting ballot access in real ways while nominally allowing people to participate from third parties in a way that really does make it an almost impossible strategy without fundamental changes in American society. But I've also pointed the irony out of people who can't imagine getting past the party problem, which is not even a constitutional problem when their program calls for stuff that would require a constitutional convention to fix. You're not going to be able to do an amendment process today with the requirement of the states, particularly with the DSA's dependence on its progressive urban locales, to do the kind of changes that its program demands about the Senate, the judiciary, a more powerful legislative branch going, which is a tradition of socialism going all the way back to the First International. That all these things are going to be very difficult without real constitutional rewrite, but the means to get to a legal constitutional rewrite under, U.S. law and history really is not spelled out or talked about. But the other thing is the ballot line isn't something you can really hold people to for these same legal constraints, nor is a third party particularly viable. So while things like the United Front and the Popular Front actually both imply and demand an independent Workers' Party or Socialist Party, there isn't an easy way to achieve that today. Now, there's an essay on J.W. Mason's blog, which I'll link, it's a guest essay by Michael Kinnucan, I think, but I'm probably mispronouncing that, called Political Parties Are Illegal in the United States, which is an obviously Mont-Bailey title, because clearly we have political parties. They're not illegal. But classical political parties, even in like the European parliamentary sense, are kind of impossible. And ironically, it's from some of the progressive reforms in the 1960s, but also this response to third parties and stuff. So it's not just the progressive reforms that have come together to create a near impossibility, not even of just a third party, but of an effective ballot line. Now, you can have informal ballot lines, but they have to be maintained by the voter base of the party, and you're not going to be able to do that with like a sub-MGO organization or an affinity group. And I think this is fundamentally something that people don't want to look at. And so I'm going to talk about these essays and give you some of the strategic implications and the weaknesses and strength of both when we're talking about, things here. Because one of the issues that I have right now is there's a whole lot of talk about getting people elected, particularly in progressive cities and particularly against very weak gerontocratic, dinosaur Democrats who've also lost a lot of their business base to the more open corruption of the moment. But, recently I was on an interview with Daniel Tutt, and we mentioned this, and Tutt pushed back on me. And I said, well, look, because Daniel said, I don't think they're bankrupt. I'm like, no, they are bankrupt. That's a factual fact. The DNC is millions of dollars in debt. They're not particularly solvent at the moment. They've lost most of their traditional donors. And they're also not getting donors directly to the DNC from small donors anymore. They've tapped that out. And the DSA has been able to fill the gap in a lot of ways. But for the more ambitious ends of both the left and the right DSA, which again is a misleading thing, because this is really about the orientation of the caucuses, because they matter for the NPC, the National Political Committee, but they don't actually have the same influence, I think, on the membership, except that their ideas amplifiers, like tendencies tend to be, and that's actually a good thing. I don't think that's bad, but it's just something that we have to think about when we view this in terms of the spectrum of where the caucuses are, because frankly, that doesn't even register with a lot of actual members. And a lot of members in the DSA really are paper members. I mean, they're real members, but they're not participating. Like, if you actually had to have not absolute, but per capita quorums for like holding meetings and doing votes, like you had to have 50% of your membership to actually have a vote be valid. The DSA couldn't vote in most chapters. So this is a problem. But also, I think, it's easy to get lost in the sauce in the DSA, like it is with any of the forms, including the sectarian formation. So the question that we have to raise to ourselves is like, how do we deal with the fact that candidate accountability is so hard by either a ballot line within a party, particularly imposed by, the party itself or outsiders, or a third party? It's just both of them are not particularly legally viable in the current situation. And the former doesn't register with people because one of the things the DSA promises. The other is this, party parasite model, and I'll talk about the problems with it too. But it's useful for understanding how to get people elected. It's very different for understanding how to maintain a movement than actually build policy or, oh my God, do actual reforms, much less anything revolutionary. So, Michael Kinnucan's political parties are illegal in the United States. Let's start with it. This essay addresses a longstanding dilemma that both left-wingers and progressives and socialists all have as an electoral strategy. When a progressive or socialist candidate wins office on a party ticket, say the Democratic one, they often compromise or move to the right for a variety of reasons. And it's not just documented in the US. We can talk about the Socialist Party in France with Mitterrand. There's a book that I was loaned by Daniel Tuck called Socialism Doomed, which is about the Mitterrand government that you should check out that gets into this problem. We've seen it with labor, and oh my God, has labor been, what labor post-Corbyn has been doing has made Blair's labor look positively, delightfully progressive. So you see this with how much of a shit show even Mark Carney's liberal party in Canada is, and I think the Canadians would be a lot more mad at the Carney government if they didn't have the third Trump down here, pushing that somewhat legitimately, honestly, Canadian nationalist response. There's all these issues. Our son president in France, Macron, is incredibly unpopular, but is holding on to a thin line, and Mélenchon's movement is growing, but there's always a looming threat of the National Front in France. The alternative for Deutschland seemed to be massively ascendant in Germany because the corruption and soft talking points of the Christian Democrats post Merkel, we see on the MERS, it's bad. All right. So this is not a unique problem to the US, but it's exacerbated in the US because we don't even get to the kinds of coalitional and parliamentary problems that they have in these other countries. We have something that's far more problematic. The activists who support progressives when this happens don't have a formal mechanism to keep them accountable. And that's one of the things that a lot of the left and the DSA caucuses, particularly Marxist Unity Group and maybe Red Star, really talk about. Right? Many activists suggest breaking away from the Democratic Party to build an independent third party. In theory, this party would have a dues-paying membership who democratically decide on endorsements, set a strict party platform, and revoke support or party membership if the elected officials break party discipline like you do in parliamentary states. This political model of a party is legally impossible in the United States, and it's also not really easily done within the Democratic Party either. And this is a problem. It is not just difficult to do electoral barriers like single-member districts or ballot access laws. State election laws explicitly prohibit political parties from operating on a disciplined member-governed organizational model. They mandate things like primaries and caucuses for candidates as a way of being democratic. But what we've actually seen with the advent of primaries and caucuses with parties is that it actually makes them less democratic. We've had a deficit of democracy from pro-democratic reforms in the middle of the 20th century that have been taken advantage of and pulled back and pushed forward. And yes, there's things you can do to ameliorate it, like, ranked choice voting or public financing of campaigns. But they're not magic bullets. We can already see because a lot of them exist in the countries that I mentioned that are having the problems that I mentioned earlier. But anyway, in most parliamentary democracies around the world, political parties are private membership associations that are like a club or lobbyist group, or trade union. I specifically didn't say an NGO because they're not like an American NGO. They can set their own internal rules that candidates decide who is allowed to use their name. In the US, once an organization achieves official ballot line status, state laws almost universally strip internal political autonomy away, except the control of donations. And that's important. States dictate that party nominees must be chosen through a state-administered primary or caucus process rather than internal party conventions or member votes. The conventions, which exist, are often just like an electoral caucus that in most states has to reflect the primary or caucus results. To participate in choosing a party candidate, a voter usually just needs to pick a box in a state voter registration form. The Democrats or Republicans don't really charge you a membership fee. The party's central leadership thus cannot vet, approve, or reject voter affiliation legally. Because candidates are chosen by whoever turns out at the primary, rather than dues-paying party members, party leadership cannot prevent non-aligned or opposing candidates from running under their party label. The only way they can control this is through the parties themselves doing it through money. So let's take a hypothetical socialist party example. Let's say that we have a Debsian socialist party, but it exists under current law. Or that we had a Debsian party-like formation even within the Democrats. Activists organize, raise funds, collect signatures, successfully establish a socialist party ballot line that is according to a program, as Kinnucan states. If a handful of voters in a rural legislative district register under the Socialist Party, state law dictates, in almost all states, that they get to decide who runs for office in that district under that party banner. The statewide party leadership has no legal mechanism to stop them or overrule their choice other than denying funding. Opposing forces can easily exploit this setup. Kinnucan points out in this essay that in states where minor parties like the Green Party hold official office ballot lines, Republican candidates frequently petition to run on a Green Party line to siphon voters away from Democrats, or to pick up unvetted voters from voters who vote straight ticket. The party leadership lacks legal authority to purge these candidates from their ballot line because of the demands of the primary and caucus process. This is a unique paradox in American constitutional law that Kinnucan points out that I don't see anyone in the DSA talking about. Groups like the National Rifle Association, the Democratic Socialists of America, or the Dog Breeders Club are treated as private voluntary organizations, are nonprofit organizations, which most of them are legally. They're 501c4s. They are free to establish strict membership criteria, enforce bylaws, and expel members, but they are not free to enforce a ballot line. Once a group transitions into an official political party on the ballot, though, states treat it as a quasi-public entity, even though these entities are legally private entities and aren't NGOs, because if you're an NGO, you really can't be a political party in the United States. That's another thing that, gets me about DSA discourse. They keep on talking about we're a party when you're not. You can't spend money like a party, and you're not recognized legally like a party. And if you were, you wouldn't be able to have a ballot line. And even within the Democratic Party, you can't really stop an endorsee from changing their ballot line once you have endorsed them. You can only pour the endorsement, and frankly, a lot of times that doesn't fucking matter. The state assumes control, the state governments, over the most vital decision-making process, which is how candidates are nominated. This is legally restricted in every state in the union. Kinnucan concludes that progressive debates over electoral strategy suffer from a fundamental misunderstanding of the law's implications. Creating a third-party ballot does not grant party control over candidates. American law enforces primary elections, and a new third party would face the exact same structural issues that prevent candidate discipline inside the Democratic or Republican parties as it does a third party. And the only way to have candidate discipline in those parties is through informal, usually monetary mechanisms like bundling and campaign money and channeling super PACs. That's the way they discipline. And that's not a democratic thing and can't be held into party lines either by the structure of U.S. law. And that is both state and federal law that would limit that. Therefore, activists seeking candidate accountability cannot rely on a traditional party apparatus with an official state ballot to enforce political discipline under current law, which is why I've also wondered about how there's no talk in the program of the DSA about dealing with state level laws, because they're a bigger part of the problem, other than like a panoply of generally accepted progressive reforms like ranked choice voting, which is also manipulable, but is better than first past the post voting. But we've seen that it doesn't lead to the magic things that people often say it does, because we can see that in Australia. Now, this leads me to another essay by Paul Heideman that's available in a Substack newsletter called The Democratic Class Struggle, and this Confessions of a Party Parasite. Heideman opens by analyzing major Democratic primary election victories won by the New York Democratic Socialists of America, the NYCDSA candidates, against the deeply entrenched Democratic Party incumbents and political machines. Deeply entrenched, but very brittle right now because they've lost their funding, which has created a space for the DSA to operate. And things like Our Revolution Pact have a lot more money. I don't love them. I've talked about them talked about the pacts. I've talked about the agencies and the problems this has for progressives. And a lot of progressives are in denial about the money and all this and where it comes from. But it is the truth. And these things do have a lot of influence right now because the DNC, as I've said, is seemingly pretty brittle. But I like to remind you that, like, Larry Ellison and Mark Andreessen and even Elon Musk have played both sides of the political party aisle forever, and they will do it again. So will Jeff Bezos. So will most of these tech oligarchs. After all, the legal infrastructure that actually set most of these people up was created either in the 1980s and 1990s by collaborations between Republican presidents and a Democratic Congress, or a Democratic president and a Republican Congress, or they were created under the Barack Obama administration, obviously, and through a lot of executive fiat and executive orders. Fun stuff. So this is an interesting thing. I think Heideman's a little bit too optimistic about the DSA strategy in the long run, because he seems to be focusing primarily on getting people in the office, not how you hold them accountable once they are. Rather than relying on a single generational talents or fluke circumstances, the NYC DSA, according to Heideman, went through a mature, disciplined organizational apparatus. I find this to be a little bit interesting. One of the things about the New York DSA is the New York DSA has been a machine in New York since the 80s, particularly going back to the Rainbow Coalition and David Dinkins and Jesse Jackson and all that stuff. I mean, they were crucial in forming the Progressive Caucus, something that most DSAers don't even know. However, and this is important, the NYC DSA is actually often at odds with both the Democratic accountability parts of the DSA and the NPC, partly over money, but also partly over the fact that even though they're 1/5 of the organization, their machine is not particularly democratic, even if it is disciplined. They have defeated candidates backed by longstanding party bosses through and borough powerhouses and traditional machine politics, but they also are a machine. And Heideman kind of ignores this. And a lot of people pretend that this machine is all a post-2015 thing, but it's not. There's a continuity here that you really have to look at, because it doesn't happen in other DSA areas, even strongholds like the Bay Area and the LA area in California, where the DSA is much weaker and much smaller. I mean, literally, the LA DSA is like 1/5 are 1/4 the size of the NYCDSA. The NYCDSA, last time I checked, is between paper members. I have no idea. They have less chapter meetings than everyone else, and their subcommittee chapters in the various boroughs don't vote. They don't have a lot of representation in the Bronx, which is interesting because that's one of AOC's areas. But the New York DSA and its 3 boroughs is like 20 to 30,000 people on paper, and it's several thousand people actively. Whereas like the LA DSA, I think is like 4,000 to 5,000 on paper and probably about 1,000 people actively. And it's the other major stronghold, although it got wiped out. And you know, it's even more reformist than the New York DSA, but it got wiped out basically in the last election run. Heideman thinks that, and I think this is actually interesting, that the DSA actually is parasitic and we should just admit it. And it's parasitic not because we want to be, because it's a function of US law. All right. In biology, an obligate parasite is an organism that cannot complete its life cycle without exploiting a host, like, you know, all those like hornets that do something are like Toxoplasmosis gondii in cats, and rats and cats. Heideman argues that the centrist DSA are correct in noting that groups like the DSA co-opt the Democratic line. They do. DSA does not do this out of spite or laziness, but because the U.S. political system leaves them no legal alternative or even a structural need for leverage. Part of the reasons is what we talked about why real political parties with ballot lines are impossible in the United States. Although we'll come back to that because that's a limit to this strategy once DSA members are in power, which is why the DSA actually has a lower incumbency success rate than the average in the United States, which I think is actually really interesting. Yes, you know about the high profile people like AOC or Bernie Sanders or you know, Zohran Mamdani, although Zohran Mamdani is in the first year of his term. You don't hear about the fact that the attrition rate of the DSA is actually and electeds is actually much higher. It's still over 50%, but it's much higher than the general incumbent advantage, which is like 90%. The reasons for that are not clear. All right. Due to single member districts, though, Heideman points out that you have ballot hurdles, you have state administrative primary elections, which we talked about. You have independent third parties that are structurally doomed to be spoilers or legal non-entities. The primary system legally forces outside movements to enter and utilize major party infrastructure if they want to win actual power. And even though this was part of the democratization movement that happened after the 1960s, and particularly the 1968 Democratic Convention being the real high point for this, the ironic side point, it's actually made people more dependent on the parties, even though parties are not formally part of the U.S. constitutional system at all. Kind of like caucuses aren't the DSA. Heideman explains that the establishment's frustration stems from the structural vulnerability that they've created for themselves. Unlike European parties with closed membership lists and central authority over who carries the party brand, U.S. parties are semi-public utilities, even though they're private organizations and technically corporations. Anyone can register as a Democrat, run in a Democratic primary if they win enough votes, claim the Democratic Party line on the ballot. Although, again, there is no Democratic Party line, and that's where things get a little bit interesting, in that there is no way to enforce a platform and, God forbid, a program on the Democratic Party line legally because of this primary system. So Heideman is right, but this is also a limit for the DSA's own strategy. Heideman's not admitting. Established party leaders rely on brand recognition, traditional endorsements, consultant-driven media buys, and whatever. I mean, and the DSA has not had a lot of success, and even now, getting the larger unions to have their endorsement wings to endorse the DSA. Zohran Mamdani was not endorsed by most of the unions in New York, but part of the reason for that is that and most unions today, I know my teachers' unions, I have no say, even as a rep, over who we endorse. We don't get to vote on that. That's picked by our political committee, which is totally outside of even what worker reps can do. Now, that varies from union and by state, but it's way more common than people realize. So there's an utter disconnect between a ballot line within the union, where it can ask for one, but it can't check or maintain it either, and it can't use your dues to do it either. And their endorsement process, which means there's really, when people talk about, oh, the unions aren't there, that really just tells you where union leadership is and where they think their bread is buttered in the usually staffing sector of union leadership. Although sometimes, rank and file presidents will have to be subject to it. But this needs to be known and addressed when you hear this talked about with unions. It's just a fact that most people ignore and most people don't want you to know. I'm usually not big on the most people don't want you to know thing, but on this, I think it really is. The unions don't want people to know that their endorsements don't even reflect their membership views. Heideman breaks down the common complaints against leftist insurgents because, you should build your own party line. Heideman notes that if socialists would create a third party, the establishment would immediately attack them for spoiling the general elections and helping the Republican win. And frankly, as we mentioned with the Kinnucan article, they can't legally do it anyway. The primary process prevents it. You aren't real Democrats. Well, we heard this too. I mean, we've seen these insurgent things in the GOP actually more than we've seen them in the Democratic Party. The last time we had a real insurgency in the Democratic Party that took the Democratic Party over was the Atari Democrats against the McGovern-Mondale line. That emerged as, in the late 60s and 70s. And the McGovern was the left wing of that. Mondale's the more moderate wing of that. And the last surviving Mondale-like Democrat was seen in the doddering old man age of uber neoliberal, but kind of nice to labor sometimes, and definitely pissed off the tech oligarchs, Joe Biden. Also, you want a real Democrat, but that doesn't mean anything because these parties are more cartel parties than they are any real substantive party or program brand. I mean, if you look at the platform pranks, that they're not hold to them, and they change like butter anyway. As long as U.S. election law utilizes state-managed primary systems and single-member plurality voting, insurgent movements will continue to operate as parasites using major party ballot line, and the DSA isn't even the first one to do it. This has been a strategy in the Republicans for a long time, and in fact, the Republican coalition under Reagan was a set of these kinds of things competing against each other, but operating under one political figure. And we saw this too with the way that paleo conservatives and former Tea Party people and former moral majority people and parts of the Christian nationalist movement all got under Trump, even though they're actually competing with each other within the Republican coalition. And that's becoming more obvious as Trump's dotage also becomes more obvious. So complaining about party rating or unfaithfulness will not save the establishment. I actually agree with Heideman about this, but what this doesn't deal with is the money problem and the fact that the DSA can't discipline its candidates either. And that's a problem. It's a real problem that I don't think anyone is dealing with. Power within the American political authorities naturally flows to whichever faction builds the most effective organizing machinery to mobilize voters in the primaries to get people elected. But that is not what the political science says about what gets policy done. And this is what infuriates me right now about a lot of this talk about the party parasite, is it does not deal with the fact that even the DSA candidates have to constantly fundraise to be competitive. And they won't, and they can't just rely on DSA feet on the ground. The DSA is very useful for getting people into office. It's not so useful once they are in office, though. And that is something that hasn't really been dealt with. That's why the New York DSA is really actually dependent on Mamdani's popularity, or it's going to have major problems. If the Mamdani candidacy, which he doesn't look to do, Mamdani's a pretty savvy politician, but if it was to go tits up, like say Brian Johnson or any of the, or many of the other progressive mayors that I can list in the last 20 years, the likelihood the DSA would go with it for quite a while. And indeed, the DSA is going to have problems if there's a Democratic president that isn't of their faction, because it has always had problems. If you look at its history, When there are Democratic presidents, DSA membership drops. It dropped significantly, about 20 to 30,000 paper members. And that's actually misleading. It dropped a lot more than that. It just also gained more. So it was able to stabilize that at about 70,000 members from its almost 100,000. Now it's around 120, I think, when I've said some places recently at 107. It's growing relatively rapidly, but it's growing relatively rapidly mainly in New York. Now, there are other victories, and there are other endorsees. There's an endorsee who's won in D.C. There's some other things. The thing is, a lot of these endorsees are not cadre candidates like Mamdani is, and progressive candidates historically have not brought other people up with them. Mamdani actually is an exception here. The Squad, by the way, was not. So both Michael Kinnucan's political parties are illegal in the United States and Paul Heideman's Confessions of a Party Parasite address the structural dilemmas facing the American left. How can socialists and progressives, and we're not the same thing, by the way, build electoral power and candidate discipline, given the unique legal design of the American political parties at the state level that is ubiquitous between the states. While Kinnucan's essay provides a legal and structural foundation, Heideman's essay provides a strategic and tactical application if your goal is just to get people in the office. This party parasite model is very good for that. But look at what happened with Trumpism. That was also a party parasite model. Trump was a Democrat who then went into the Reform Party. He actually tried to get the Reform Party's candidacy nomination in 2000, which is where that whole Simpsons predicts Trump thing comes from. And they did do that. But one of the things that's interesting is a lot of these insurgencies within the party start to reflect the concerns of the party's donors. There have been left-wing insurgencies in the Democratic Party before, particularly in the 1970s. And they were decimated in the 1980s. And a lot of those people are still around. You might know some of them, like Nancy Pelosi and Feynman. So the American legal architecture, as Kinnucan diagnosis, forbids political parties from functioning as closed disciplined membership organizations, even if they're democratically responsive internally. Once a party gains a state ballot line, the state forces it to choose candidates via state-administered primaries open to anyone who registers. This is actually a really big limit for the DSA, and this is one thing I really want to point out, because the other closed organizations who are super PACs can do a lot of money. DSA has a super PAC. No one cares about DSA super PAC. It doesn't have a lot of money. The DSA, despite its massive membership, whenever it has a membership crisis and it drops membership, it actually also has a funding crisis because its growth is totally tied to its membership growth. It doesn't have other ways of getting funding, and that's not true even for the sectarian parties. Like those third parties that are full, that they have other funders. They have private donors and all kinds of stuff. DSA does not have that, nor is it true for most super PACs. But an NGO that is also transparent about its money, because you could be a 501c4 and not be transparent about your money. That's why they normally are used that way. You have a limit on how you can discipline your candidates too, because if you don't have money to discipline, you can't use a ballot line, because the same primary process problem that allows the DSA parasites to enter it means the DSA cannot control candidates once they're elected either, because they cannot control a ballot line because of the primary process. And until you figure that shit out, this is a way to get people in office, but not maintain any fidelity to a program, which is why when I was mentioning the program, and I was talking about how weird, and I think most of it's interpreted one way, but it feels like, I've also said it feels like it was written to keep all the caucuses happy. That's one thing, but you can't enforce that program even on electeds, because what are you going to do? You're not giving them most of their money. Mamdani gets more money from Fight Agency or the various super PACs that support progressives like Our Revolution, our candidates we deserve, or whatever, than he does a DSA. Which is why he's, even though the DSA has claimed certain victories, He's had anti-DSA progressives like Brad Warner, who used to be in the DSA but left, on his thing, and he has Obama people in his operational staff, and has been making all kinds of peons to Obama, which should make socialists worried. But a lot of socialists like, oh, Obama's popular. Not amongst the progressives and leftists who actually live through his policy, but from a lot of apolitical people, yes, he is. This is a problem, because this makes this about personalities. And if you're arguing that you need a super strong legislature, but you're trained on people to have personalities that are more associated with the executive, you're going to have a real problem with the program. And you're also going to have no way to enforce that program unless you start changing state laws. But a lot of the laws you'd have to change to do this actually look to the general public less democratic. And the DSA is big push right now, and I don't even think totally inaccurately, is that they're a way more democratic organization, or way more transparent organization than the other organization in politics, which is actually probably in some ways true. Although, except the whole thing about membership participation being very low, but they are transparent. How do I know that the membership participation is very low? Because most DSA chapters are very transparent about their voting records. They have to be. It's part of DSA internal bylaws and culture. So both offers base their analysis on the insight that medical and political parties are not private clubs, but they are private corporations that are treated, as far as ballot access goes, as semi-public utilities controlled by state election law. Kinnucan explains the vulnerability of this legal structure. State law prevents party bosses from vetting, approving, or expelling political candidates or voters they don't want, frankly. Heideman shows that insurgent groups like Democratic Socialist America can leverage this legal vulnerability to get candidates in office. But this is still a problem, all right? Because Democratic establishment candidates cannot legally bar the DSA from running on a Democratic Party line or restrict party participation, at least without changing significant bylaws and state laws. But they actually could do that, and they've done it in the past, believe it or not. An organized minority can run a frontal attack on a trans-party machinery and win the party's line through a primary turnout, but they're going to have a hard time keeping those candidates funded. And that's the part that people don't want to deal with. You live in a capitalist society, my friends. You really have to think about this. And you live in a federated republic. And so you can't just rely on progressive districts and progressive cities either. Both essays critique the common impulse amongst left-wing activists, one that I've even said, that we should have a desire to build a clean, independent third party immediately. I've said this too, though. I don't think we can build a third party right now either. There's both a legal trap and a strategic trap under the current system. The strategic trap is actually a result of the legal trap. But as I've said, I find Heideman not really... He sees the benefits of this for getting DSA candidates into office and for the DSA to be a bigger force in the Democratic Party when the center has become so very unpopular amongst its own base by just ignoring it forever, which even the Republicans don't do, although they are right now. But historically, they don't do it. But there's a deeper strategic trap that Kinnucan spells out that I don't think the Heideman thing sees, and that has to do with what you do once you're in office and what this primary thing means when you're in office. So even if third-party candidate clears all the hurdles to get on the ballot line, state law immediately takes away its ability to select its own candidates according to the ballot line, and that's going to be a problem for the DSA too. The DSA can endorse as it sees fit, but it often doesn't endorse based on, the national's pretty lit thing, but chapters can endorse based on whatever the fucking chapter votes on. And it is democratic, but like it's vibes. And again, there's not absolute quorum. Like the DSA knows that it would be suicidal for it to have quorum that required per capita adjustments to the quorum. It has, I think, mostly absolute numbers. I need to actually look up the bylaws again, but it is actually rather low as a percentage. Opening up primary raids are candidate line runs running under a banner, or even enemy candidates running under its banner as a trap. If socialists run on a third-party line, the establishment attacks them as spoilers, rightly. If they run as Democratic primaries, the establishment attracts them as parasites. Well, the thing is, being a parasite is the only way you can actually function to change parties in America. I mean, even third parties in America have historically not aimed to take power. They've aimed to pressure a party that they're spoiling to adopt part of their platform into their platform. But that doesn't work for like systematic programmatic socialist parties because a program is not a platform. You really need to explain that. But I'm doing it in writing in an article I'm writing that's taking me forever to write. I was going really well, but then the book tour screwed it up. And then school started. I'll get back to it. So while both essays offer compelling structural analysis of American election law and insurgent strategy, both Michael Kinnucan and Paul Heideman rely on specific frameworks that leave their arguments open to significant legal, historical, and strategic criticism. So let's talk about the weaknesses in both these analyses, because I do think they're actually important. Kinnucan's central thesis that ideological discipline political parties are legal and possible in the U.S. because state law mandates open our primary nomination process, overstates legal constraints and understates non-legal mechanisms of political discipline, which I actually think is true. But the non-legal mechanisms actually don't favor grassroots stuff either. And that's something that we need to really talk about. State law election codes govern how qualifying parties nominate candidates, but states do not uniformly ban internal party autonomy across all levels. Some states allow convention-based nominations under specific ballot access thresholds or through minor party provisions. So while this is generally true in most states, there are some very niche exceptions in some states. Kinnucan argues that state regulations completely strips parties of associational control, but the Supreme Court precedent, namely California Democratic Party versus Jones in 2000, affirmed that political parties do possess First Amendment rights of free association that limit state power to curtail their ballot line. The court struck down California's blanket primary precisely because it forced parties to associate with candidates and voters outside of their self-defined boundaries. While states regulate primaries, parties retain significant constitutional protections that are not dealt with here. But I don't think this undoes the Kinnucan problem, and this is the issue. There are ways in which there's other informal mechanisms. The other thing is there's legal enforcement versus political discipline that you have to deal with. Historically and internationally, even political party discipline is usually not primarily enforced through courtroom enforceable contracts or legal expulsions of members. It is maintained through informal or institutional levers, control over the campaign funding, committee assignments, endorsement apparatuses, leadership patronage, and collective brand value. And that's a problem for the DSA. The same thing that seems to be the advantage that the DSA Parasite strategy opens up and is really helpful for getting candidates in office. What candidates can do in office, however, is really limited by committee assignments and campaign funding. And that's going to be difficult to deal with. A minor socialist organization also fails to enforce discipline on elected officials because state law forbids it, sure, but more importantly, it lacks institutional carrying and stick power. It doesn't have funding, it doesn't have legislative backing, it doesn't have media power to make breaking party ranks easy. So in small cases with third parties, it's really open, but like there is discipline in the parties around planks. But this is not in the DSA's favor as much as it looks, because you need a lot of money, and the DSA does not have massive amounts of money and is legally constrained by the way it is structured its both internal bylaws and its 501c4 status from being like a super PAC. And even though it has a pact, there is a DSA pact. That pact is really minimal and kind of ignored by the DSA members. No one's ever asked me to give to it. Now, minor parties in American history, such as the Nonpartisan League in North Dakota, the former Labor Party in Minnesota, the American Labor Party and Working Families Party in New York, although both of those are basically proxies for the Democratic Party at this point, have successfully wielded electoral leverage, done cross-endorsement, or fusion voting without being legally inert by state regulations. However, I would say that they've still mostly had to kowtow to Democratic Party ballot lines or whatever group that they're really working with ballot lines in most states. Heideman's argument that socialists must act as obligate parasites using Democratic ballot line because the primary system allows organized insurgents to capture the hollow party shells suffers from strategic oversimplifications and blind spots once you're in office. Primary turnout is not the same as general election viability. And this has really shown up but in the past. Heideman celebrates the fact that New York DSA's ability to run Democratic primaries in deep blue urban districts. Brooklyn. The Bronx, where the DSA isn't even that represented. Its membership is actually quite low in the Bronx, but that's where AOC hails from, where low primary turnout warrants high density voter organizations. But voter in primaries, even in cities that like winning the primary is actually how you get city office, like in New York, actually still very low voter turnout. Even a very, very high turnout vote like Mamdani versus Cuomo is still pretty low. I think it's like 60%. Capturing a major party's ballot line in the primary does not automatically make the insurgent program viable in the general election in purple-red districts, nor does it make it enforceable on those candidates once they're in office. Centrist or conservative voters may reject the insurgent candidate or boycott the ticket altogether. They might change sides. And also, they might deny candidate money. And even for Mamdani, this is an issue. Mamdani is very popular. He's been able to leverage a lot of political savvy against like Hochul. But if Hochul cuts the spigot off, Mamdani's programs fall apart. Heideman also assumes major party shells will retain permanently passive and exploitable membership. But in reality, party establishments frequently alter party rules, change voter registration deadlines, increase campaign finance thresholds, deploy heavy expenditures under campaigns and super PACs, which they're not supposed to coordinate with, but good luck proving under current law, to insulate themselves once insurgent threat is recognized, and to capture the insurgents themselves through funding and through popularity access. This is why I think people should be more worried about the DSA's relationship with Mamdani and Obama. State legislatures controlled by majorities hostile to insurgents can and do often rewrite state election laws, infusion voting tactics in many states, although I did mention some that have been successful, change primary formats, such as moving to nonpartisan top two primaries, or gerrymandered districts to neutralize insurgent hubs. The reason why the current Democrats have not been able to do that is they don't have the patronage right now. Most of the donations are going to a very unpopular GOP. By running against Democrat, socialist candidates enter legislative caucuses dominated by a party establishment, and with that establishment's funding mechanisms. Once inside the legislative body, these candidates face immense pressure to vote with party leadership for committee assignments, bill passages, and leadership posts. This has happened to other left-wing insurgents. A lot of the centrist Democrats that are now in their 80s were leftist insurgents in the 70s. That really needs to be known. Van Jones, former Maoist that was rejected from the Obama White House because of his Maoist past, now goes out against the DSA and sounds like a fucking neoliberal. How does that happen, people? It's not just about everyone being a corrupt actor. Although they are, but that's not the point. How did they get corrupt? They don't start that way. Heideman's model does not serve the accountability problem either, and this is where it really hits the problem. This is the problem with the Parasite model. This is why basing things off Trump is quite interesting, because one of the things that we've noticed about Trump, both in Trump 1 and Trump 2, is for all his shenanigans and all his weirdness and everything else, a lot of the worst stuff he's done is actually in line with traditional Republican values since Reagan. Once parasitic candidates win ballot line in office, insurgent groups still lack formal legal or institutional levers to prevent their electeds from compromising with broader Democratic caucusnesses are their funders. Kinnucan argues that formal legal design of the U.S. political system forbids structured party discipline, while Heideman argues that socialists must exploit the exact legal design to build informal real-world power. But the problem is we don't have power over those candidates once they are in office. There is no way under the current system, the DSA's 130,000 people cannot discipline people whose districts are far larger than that and far less diffuse. Even in New York, 30,000 people is still really a faction. It is not mass in regards to the total population. Mamdani himself, however, is massively popular and has been popular even probably more so the longer he's in office. That's good for the DSA, but it also presents problems as he has many things that he does that parts of the DSA left, and even parts of the DSA right don't like, but they don't want to stand up too much against him because they're so associated with him. They don't have independent identities beyond these celebrity candidates. And this is another structural problem that isn't dealt with. Populist left insurgents are more popular when we're under austerity, but that is also the very reason why they have a hard time, since they don't live in areas at the level of government that has currency sovereignty, to do anything about it. One of the reasons is a lot of people go, oh, well, this is standing against a two-party democracy, and Americans don't care if they don't actually deliver. Bullshit. The historical record does not show that. Left populists get punished for not delivering the goods that they promised. Progressive policies are popular, but most people don't trust progressives to implement them with good reason. And right now, people are desperate, and they're hoping that a new insurgent can actually deliver. And there are some things that Mamdani has delivered on, even as I pointed out in many of my talks publicly, that many of them are expansions of Bill de Blasio policies. But those expansions are meaningful and significant. All right, but they are not the same thing as everything that is being promised. And that will eventually come home to roost, particularly as the budget situation gets tighter and tighter. We have some major problems that you're not going to be able to spend your way out of in the United States regarding infrastructure, regarding order, regarding AI, and just passing regulation isn't going to fix it, fucking buddy. I'm sorry, but you guys need a reality check on this. You have to be more radical to be more pragmatic in many ways. All right. Heideman's party Parasite framework aligns closely with the anachronisms of American political politics because it accepts the electoral system as it exists and doesn't confuse legal status with political power. Heideman recognized the state-run primary elections as a primary arena for electoral conflict in the U.S. Is a limit, but that ballot line is vulnerable to primary challenges. And the New York DSA has been able to exploit that. Although, again, I think this New York DSA's magic attitude right now is actually somewhat interesting to me. Because it doesn't play into the fact that Chromost or Crepitude was actually uniquely able to get Mamdani the chance that he got in the first place, and that New York had ballot funding laws that many other states don't have, and a lot of those states have had much harder times getting DSA insurgents to have any real pull. Heideman's analysis does actually have some strengths on Kinnucan's on one issue, is that you don't necessarily need legal ownership of the party to exercise power. Most of the party power brokers don't have legal ownership of it either now. But that's also a weakness for Heideman, as I pointed it out. Organizing capacity, field operations, volunteer grassroots fundraising during primary elections and take over the ballot lines is perfectly possible, but that's not effective for getting electeds to carry out policy in office. And that's not dealt with. That's just not dealt with. Fundamentally not dealt with. And the ballot line strategy, the internal ballot line strategy of like a program, a secret program, or it's not secret, it's public. To do that, you're not going to be able to enforce it. And most you can do is pull your endorsement. And I'm frankly going to tell you that once these electeds are in, like the DSA's relationship to AOC seems schizophrenic in a lot of ways because she's bucked both platform and programmatic planks, and that's the great debate about her being endorsed. I do think there's an issue, regardless, because the AOC will be associated with the DSA whether they endorse her or not. But she doesn't care so much about the DSA in the same way anymore. She might care about it in the presidential election because it becomes a cadre of a lot of people who can do a lot of canvassing. But in the same case, they're a liability when she's in office. There's no way around that unless you change both state and federal law, and that requires slower building policies and building institutions outside of just electoral apparatuses to do. And the DSA hasn't really done that. Kinnucan's structural argument points directly to a major limitation in Heideman's strategic orientation. Winning primaries does not solve candidate accountability problems once those candidates take office. I've said it over and over again. Under Heideman's model, the insurgent group can successfully use the Democratic ballot line to elect a candidate, but once that candidate enters the legislature, as I've said multiple times tonight, there is no legal or institutional mechanism to force elected officials to vote in lockstep with the group's platform unless they control enough members in enough states to control committee appointments. And that requires money and funding that the DSA does not have, and frankly cannot have, as long as it is a primarily member-funded organization. Even the Democratic Party needs something else, because if they were a party, they can't do that. They can't be a primary member organization. See the other thing that we talked about. So you have to rely on all these formal legal mechanisms and all these informal money mechanisms, unless you have major constitutional and legal reform at both the state and federal level. And even though I have been giving the DSA a lot of props for realizing the constitutional problems that it has and proposing radically the admission that it would, even though they don't call for a constitutional convention, that's the only way you could do the kind of constitutional reforms that they want. You could not easily do enough amendments to do it. You could do like one or two of them, but like you're going to amend most of the articles of the Constitution away. Yeah, that's not likely to happen in the U.S. Because party mechanisms, too, remain in a legal shell rather than just a membership body, the elected official often gets absorbed into the body politic caucus, making concessions to the party leadership for committee assignments and legislative priority, and for funding access a priority. The parasite might run the primary, but the institutional structure of the legislative body often tames the candidate. And they're often hard to control, these anti-political candidates. See Trump, who's not anti-political anymore, but nonetheless. So if we look at the recent victories, it has proved that for getting people elected, this obligate parasite thing that Heideman does works. The DSA does not attempt to build a third-party ballot line. It's systemically ran inside Democratic primaries, but although there are some places where it's run independently. And I actually would encourage that outside of deep blue areas. Winning the Democratic primary is functionally equivalent to winning the general election in deep blue urban districts. However, and this does confirm Prima's point, but the post-election reality really does make this seem really naive. Kinnucan warns that because political parties in the United States are legally regulated, an organization cannot legally or structurally control its candidates once they take office. DSA pack candidates either into the state legislature, city council, they will join the broader Democratic legislative coalition and will have to make concessions to it. There's no way around that. Once elected, officials face immense pressure to align with party leadership or donors' funding priorities to secure chairmanships, pass legislation, and secure budget elections, and also get their funding in there to continue to be able to run. Because the DSA is a nonprofit 501c4 political organization and not a legally existing problem. It likes formal levers like mandatory party expulsion or candidate denomination to force elected officials to vote in lockstep with the organization's platform, and it lacks the funding availability that those platforms have to punish candidates informally through the use of super PACs. So while Heideman does give us a correct way to win primary elections in deep blue urban districts, and that's what we've seen, El Said is the exception here, actually. The DSA, for example, I've also talked about the Senate. One of the reasons why the DSA wants to abolish the Senate is the Senate is an anti-democratic institution. However, it is not. This is one thing I think the DSA analysis doesn't deal with. It is not subject to gerrymandering. That is the one advantage it has, which is why it has been a check on Trump's power. Even the Republican Senate. this has to be dealt with more seriously than a lot of the DSA does, because for its like anti-senatorial bin, and something that I think they're right about, the Senate is undemocratic. You'd really also have to change election laws in every fucking state in the country. That's still not dealt with. There's also no real way, even under Heideman's framework, for it to enforce its platform or program, and that's going to be really important. So this does expose a series of critical implications for how the DSA structures its platform, its program, manages elections official, and navigates the transition from an electoral insurgency to an actual governing power, and maybe is able to stay in office at a more regular rate than what they currently have. A central debate around the DSA revolves around the dirty break, although that idea has been largely abandoned by nearly everybody. The socialists should run the Democratic ballot line temporarily while bending independent organizational capacity. But the legal analysis demonstrates that a clean break under an independent ballot line will not achieve this desired end state, nor will a dirty break unless you've already changed election laws, which would require you to federally operate in areas that are outside of where this insurgent advantage of deep blue city primaries works. And that's a problem. And I can't get people to take it seriously. Maybe you guys will. Protect your peace. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. You can find more behind the wall on the Patreon and read these articles. They're actually quite good, and learn from them. I've thought a lot about this. I actually do believe an independent working class party is absolutely necessary. I also think under the current environment, it's impossible, and that you're in a structural catch-22 even when the insurgency works, because of the funding powers of capital that are not being dealt with. There is very little evidence, as I've pointed multiple times, that once candidates are in office, that voter effects matter all that much, particularly the more national you go. By voter effects, I mean what voters actually want.